Beneath the flickering glow of the northern lights, a lone figure stands shrouded in furs, their voice rising in a haunting chant that cuts through the Arctic night. This is no ordinary Viking, this is a seer, a völva, a bridge between the world of the living and the unseen forces that shape destiny. Imagine the weight of that moment, the hushed anticipation of warriors and chieftains gathered around, their futures hanging on every whispered prophecy. These seers weren't just storytellers or wise elders, they were conduits of the divine, wielding rituals so mysterious, so potent, that their echoes still send shivers down our spines centuries later. The völvas of the Viking Age were more than myth, they were the keepers of secrets, the weavers of fate. With rituals that blurred the line between reality and the supernatural, they peered into the unknown, predicting battles, interpreting omens, and even communing with the dead. Their methods were as eerie as they were effective, chanting in trance-like states, brewing hallucinogenic potions, and performing ceremonies under the watchful eyes of the gods. Some accounts speak of seers who could summon storms or curse enemies with a single breath, their power rooted in practices so enigmatic that modern scholars still grapple to understand them fully. Tonight, we're stepping into their world. Over the course of this journey, we'll uncover 30 of their most astonishing rituals, each one a glimpse into a mind-bending tradition where magic and reality collided. From bone-chilling divination rites to sacred dances meant to awaken ancient spirits, these practices reveal a side of the Vikings far removed from the battlefields and longships we know so well. So ready yourself for whispers from the past, for stories that defy explanation, and for a deeper look into the shadows where the seers once walked. The mysteries begin now. The Seiðr Ceremony was perhaps the most enigmatic and unsettling ritual in the Viking Seers' arsenal. Picture this, a völva, cloaked in feathers and animal skins, perched high on a wooden platform as firelight flickers against the faces of the gathered crowd. The air thrums with the rhythm of a handheld drum, its steady beat guiding her into a trance so deep, the boundaries between this world and the next begin to blur. This was no mere performance, it was a sacred act of crossing over. The Seidr practitioners' chants weren't just words, they were keys, unlocking doors to realms where spirits whispered secrets of the future. At the heart of this ritual lay a connection to Freyja, the Norse goddess of love, war, and sorcery. Legend says she taught Seidr to Odin himself, though its practice became deeply tied to women, particularly the völvas who wielded it with chilling precision. Through these trances, seers claimed to see beyond the veil, predicting the outcomes of battles, warning of looming famines, or even revealing the fates of entire clans. But such power came at a cost. The deeper the trance, the greater the risk. Some accounts describe seers collapsing, their bodies racked with convulsions as spirits fought to speak through them. Others tell of völvas who never fully returned, their minds lost somewhere between the living and the dead, yet not all Vikings revered this practice. For many, especially among the warrior class, Seidr carried a stain of dishonor. Magic in Norse society walked a fine line, admired when it served practical ends, but suspect when it leaned into the unknown. The fluidity of Seidr, its ties to the feminine and the unseen, made some dismiss it as unmanly, even dangerous. Odin's association with it only deepened the paradox. The Allfather himself was both praised and criticized for his willingness to dive into such murky arts. This tension reveals a fascinating duality in Viking culture, a society that celebrated strength and steel, yet still made room for those who spoke with ghosts. Blood spilled in the name of prophecy wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a sacred language. When Viking seers sought answers from the gods, they turned to blood divination, a ritual as visceral as it was mysterious. Picture the scene, a freshly slain horse, its life force pooling across a stone altar known as a hurga, while the völva crouched low, studying the way the crimson liquid spread, bubbled, or congealed. Every spatter held meaning, every swirl a potential message from the other side. The richer the sacrifice, the clearer the signs, or so they believed. These altars weren't mere slabs of rock, they were thresholds between worlds, often placed on high ground or near sacred groves. Hurga stones were believed to amplify the connection to the divine. The seer would trace her fingers through the blood, chanting invocations to Odin or Freyja, watching for patterns that might reveal hidden truths. A sudden clot could warn of betrayal, while a thin, spreading streak might signal a prosperous harvest. But the blood's behavior wasn't just read in isolation, it danced in conversation with the elements. A gust of wind distorting the flow, that was the breath of the gods steering the interpretation. Rain diluting the blood, a sign of cleansing or perhaps divine displeasure. The choice of sacrifice mattered deeply. Horses, revered for their speed and connection to the afterlife, were the most prized offerings. Their blood was thought to carry the wisdom of the slain, a bridge to the spirits who rode with Valkyries. Some sagas describe seers demanding specific colors or ages of horses, believing these traits tuned the ritual to certain gods or questions. And the act of killing itself was a ritual, a swift, respectful stroke, because a struggle or a cry of pain could taint the reading, muddying the messages from beyond. Yet this practice wasn't without its skeptics. Even among the Norse, interpretations varied wildly. One seer might see a promise of victory where another sensed only doom, leading to heated debates among chieftains weighing the risks of battle or voyage. And as Christianity crept north, blood divination became a target for condemnation, branded as barbaric or demonic. But for centuries, in the flickering torchlight of those altars, the Vikings believed they could read fate itself, written in the language of life and loss, one scarlet stroke at a time. There was no force more feared or more revered than the Norns, the three shadowy weavers who spun the threads of every Viking's destiny. Unlike the gods who could be swayed by offerings or flattery, the Norns were merciless in their judgments. Yet the seers claimed there was one ritual, one fleeting chance to bend their will even just a little. It began with a bone, not just any bone, but one taken from a creature of significance, a raven's wing, a wolf's rib, or sometimes even the finger bone of a fallen ancestor. The völva would etch the names of the Norns verdandi and sculpt into its surface, each stroke of the knife a whispered plea to the past, present, and future. This wasn't mere carving, it was an act of confrontation. The seer would hold the bone over a flame until the runes blackened, then press it into the palm of her client, a chieftain desperate for victory, a mother pleading for her child's survival. As the heat seared skin, the völva chanted a question into the smoke. What is woven can be unwoven. Show us the loose thread. The belief was bold. By forcing the Norns' names into the physical world, the seer could momentarily disrupt fate's tapestry, creating an opening for change. Some sagas describe warriors carrying these bones into battle, their charred surfaces cracking mid-fight, a sign the Norns were reworking their design. But the ritual came with warnings. A misaligned rune, a rushed carving, or even a faltering voice could twist the plea into a curse. One account tells of a merchant who demanded his seer etch the Norns' names too deep. By morning, his ship had sunk in calm waters, as if the threads of his fate had snapped under the weight of his arrogance. The seers understood the delicate balance. The Norns tolerated negotiation, but never defiance. What's fascinating is how this ritual mirrored Viking life itself, relentless in pursuit of control, yet humbled by the unseen forces that shaped their world. Even the bravest berserker knew some threads were not theirs to cut. When the winter winds howled across the Norse lands, the bravest, or perhaps the most foolish, would swear they heard the thunder of ghostly hooves in the distance. This was the night of the wild hunt, a spectral procession of the dead led by none other than Odin himself. Viking seers spoke of witnessing the hunt in visions, their bodies rigid with terror as the phantom army tore across the sky. The riders weren't just shadows, they were fallen warriors, their faces twisted in eternal battle cries, their horses' eyes burning like embers. To see the hunt was both an omen and a curse, a sign of coming war or plague, but also a fleeting connection to those who'd crossed into the afterlife. Some völvas claimed to ride with them in spirit, their souls temporarily unshackled from their bodies to gallop beside the slain, gathering whispers of the future from the mouths of the dead. But the wild hunt wasn't the only way seers bridged the world of the living and the departed. When a Viking fell ill, wasting away without wound or fever, it was often blamed on a stolen soul. The person might still breathe, but something vital had slipped away, snatched by spirits or lost in the labyrinth of the afterlife. Enter the soul-fetching ritual, a delicate and dangerous act where the völva would send her own spirit wandering to retrieve what was taken. Clutching a talisman, often a carved wooden figure or a bundle of herbs tied with human hair, she'd chant until her breathing slowed to near stillness. In this trance, she described crossing mist-covered rivers or climbing roots of the world tree, bargaining with entities whose names she dared not speak aloud. Success wasn't guaranteed. Some souls fought their rescuers, refusing to return. Others were held hostage by vengeful spirits demanding payment, a lock of the family's hair, a prized weapon thrown into a bog. The tools of soul-fetching were as symbolic as they were practical. A seer might use a soul net woven from flax grown in a single moon cycle, its knots tied with 9 rhymes to trap wandering spirits. Or she'd place a bowl of milk at the patient's bedside, a beacon for the lost soul to recognize home. The most chilling accounts tell of völvas returning from these journeys with their lips blue and their fingers frostbitten, as if they'd brushed against the cold edges of death itself. What's striking is how these rituals mirrored the Vikings' fatalism and their defiance of it. They believed in destiny, yet they sent their seers clawing back souls from the underworld. They feared the wild hunt's omens, yet they sought its knowledge. Even in the face of the inevitable, they fought, not with swords but with whispers and charms, proving that magic for the Norse was never just about power. It was about bargaining with the darkness on their own terms. Among the most striking rituals of Viking Seers was the bone throw, a practice where carved fragments of bear, wolf, or even human knuckles clattered onto a woven cloth, their landing position spelling out fate itself. Unlike the blood divination's visceral intensity or the trance-like depths of Seidr, this ritual was swift yet no less profound. Each bone bore symbols carefully etched by the völva's hand: a raven's wing for impending death, a sunwheel for triumph, a serpent for hidden betrayal. The moment those bones left her fingers, the air grew thick with anticipation, as if the gods themselves leaned in to watch where they fell. The cloth mattered just as much as the bones. Woven from undyed wool, sometimes spun by a woman who'd never known loss, other times stained with ash from a funeral pyre, it acted as a map between worlds. A bone landing near the edge might signal a journey, one tangled in the weave hinted at delays or unseen obstacles. But the true art lay in the seer's ability to read the patterns as a living story. A raven touching a sunwheel didn't just mean death and victory. It could warn that glory would come at a terrible cost, or that a leader's fall would pave the way for new strength. Some völvas spoke of bones that refused to settle, quivering as if tugged by invisible hands, a sign the spirits were especially vehement in their message. What's fascinating is how this ritual echoes in modern games of chance. The Vikings' bone throws were the ancestors of dice, their symbols evolving into the numbered cubes we roll today. But while we might wager coins on a lucky toss, the seers were gambling with destinies. A saga recounts a chieftain demanding 3 throws before a raid each time the raven appeared. Ignoring the omen, he sailed anyway, and his ship was dashed against the rocks by a storm not even the crew's seasoned navigators foresaw. The bones, it seemed, held knowledge beyond the skies. Yet the ritual wasn't just about doom. A young farmer might seek a bone reading before proposing marriage, desperate for the sunwheel's blessing. a mother might clutch a bare knuckle carved with protective runes, hoping its landing would assure her child's recovery. For all its mystery, the bone throw was deeply human, a gamble not against the house but against the unfathomable whims of the universe. And sometimes, just sometimes, the bones would grant a mercy, their patterns aligning in a way that let the seer smile and whisper, "The threads are kind today." The skulls spoke if you knew how to listen. Viking seers believed the dead held wisdom beyond the grave, and some went to terrifying lengths to access it. Among their most unsettling rituals was the practice of collecting whispering skulls, particularly those of ancestors or fallen enemies, to serve as conduits for prophecy. These weren't just relics, they were instruments, their hollowed eyes and gaping jaws treated as gateways to the other side. The völva would cradle a skull in her hands, her breath fogging the bone as she chanted, waiting for the faintest murmur, a whisper only she could decipher. Archaeology confirms the eerie reality behind these legends. In Swedish bogs, where the peat preserves secrets like a time capsule, researchers have unearthed skulls etched with runes, their inscriptions pleading or demanding answers. One, found near the remnants of a ritual platform, bore the words, "Speak to me, Father," carved along the brow, a direct appeal to the dead. Another, riddled with precise drill marks, suggests some seers may have attempted to open the skull symbolically, as if drilling a hole for the spirit to pass through. The choice of bogs wasn't accidental. To the Norse, these waterlogged lands were liminal spaces, neither fully earth nor water, where the veil between worlds grew thin. Depositing a skull there was like dropping a letter into a supernatural mailbox, ensuring the dead would receive it. But not all whispering skulls were ancestral. Some belonged to enemies, taken as trophies from battlefields and later repurposed as oracles. A saga recounts a völva who kept the skull of a rival seer, forcing it to reveal its secrets by threatening to grind it into amulets if it stayed silent. The psychological power of this act was as potent as the supernatural claim. Imagine a warrior recognizing the hollowed face of a once feared foe now reduced to a seer's tool. The rituals varied. Some völvas filled the cranial cavity with herbs like henbane or nightshade, their hallucinogenic fumes supposedly loosening the dead's tongues. Others placed the skull atop a pole, letting the wind howl through its cavities, interpreting the eerie whistles as speech. The most chilling accounts describe skulls answering by cracking abruptly during ceremonies, a sign the spirit within had broken through, or perhaps resisted. What's striking is how these practices reveal the Vikings' pragmatism. Even in death, nothing was wasted. A fallen enemy's skull could become a weapon of knowledge. A beloved ancestor's remains might offer guidance when the living fell short. The whispering skulls remind us that for the seers, the past wasn't gone. It was just waiting to be heard. When the skies darkened and the winds howled like wolves, the Viking seers knew it was time to dance. Not the celebratory steps of a feast, but something far older, a rhythmic, almost trance-like stomping that seemed to shake the earth itself. Cloaks of wolfskin or raven feathers whirled around them as they moved, their feet pounding the ground in patterns said to mimic thunder. This was the weather dance, a ritual as fierce as the storms it sought to summon or soothe. To witness it was to stand at the mercy of forces beyond human control, watching as mere mortals dared to bargain with the tempest. The connection to Thor was undeniable. The god of thunder didn't just command storms, he was the storm, his chariot wheels rumbling across the heavens. Seers channeled that raw energy, their dances acting as a plea or a challenge. A clockwise circle might beg for calm seas ahead of a voyage, while a counterclockwise spin, arms raised like gnarled branches, could summon gales to wreck an enemy's fleet. Some accounts describe völvas wearing iron rings, a nod to Thor's hammer, which they'd shake toward the sky, the clang of metal against metal echoing like distant lightning. Timing was everything. These dances weren't performed at random, but at the hinge moments of the year, the first frost, the spring thaw, or when strange cloud formations loomed. One saga tells of a seer who danced for 3 nights straight as a fishing village watched, her movements growing slower, heavier, until on the final dawn, the storm veered out to sea instead of swallowing their boats. The villagers called it a miracle. The seer, exhausted and hoarse, called it a deal, one she wouldn't reveal, but the weathered dance wasn't just about survival. It was theater, a visceral reminder that the Vikings saw nature not as a backdrop, but as a character in their stories. When a chieftain planned a raid, he might demand a dance to test the gods' favor. If the seer stumbled, it was a bad omen. If she moved with unnatural grace, as if lifted by invisible hands, the men would cheer, certain of victory. Yet there's a darker thread in the tales, 2 seers who danced too long, too hard, and collapsed with lungs bleeding from the effort, their last breath a whispered warning no one could decipher. What's fascinating is how these rituals blur the line between prayer and performance. The seers weren't just asking for weather, they were embodying it, their bodies becoming conduits for the same forces that filled their sails and shattered their enemies. And in that wild, swirling dance, they proved something essential about the Viking world. Even the wind could be negotiated with if you knew the right steps. The mead bubbled thick and dark in its cauldron, a concoction so potent that even the gods might hesitate before drinking. Viking seers called it the mead of prophecy, a hallucinogenic brew of fermented honey laced with henbane, yarrow, and other herbs plucked under the full moon's silver gaze. This wasn't just drink, it was a key to the unseen, a liquid gateway to visions no sober mind could bear. When a völva raised the carved horn to her lips and drank deep, she wasn't merely intoxicated. She was transformed, her senses unraveling until the threads of time itself became visible. The rituals around this mead were as precise as they were perilous. The honey had to come from hives nestled near burial mounds where the buzz of bees mingled with whispers of the dead. Henbane, with its sleepy, poisonous petals, was added in exact measures, too little, and the visions would stay hidden, too much, and the seer might never wake. As the brew fermented, the völva would chant over it, her words seeping into the mixture like spells. By the time it was ready, the mead wasn't just a drink. It was a living thing, thick with the weight of prophecy, and then came the trances. Those who drank described a sensation like falling, not downward but sideways through layers of reality. The mead dragged them into a twilight realm where the future flickered like reflections in a storm-washed puddle. Some saw fragments of Ragnarök, the great wolf Fenrir's jaws snapping shut, the serpent Jörmungandr thrashing in the seas, the sky itself splitting open like rotten fruit. One saga recounts a seer who drank too deeply and awoke screaming, her nails clawing at her arms as she babbled about the sun turning black and the earth sinking into the sea. Her listeners dismissed it as madness until a volcanic eruption months later stained the skies ash-gray for weeks, just as she described. What's chilling is how these visions mirrored the Vikings' own worldview. They didn't fear Ragnarök, they expected it, prepared for it, even welcomed it as the ultimate test of courage. The mead of prophecy didn't just show them doom, it showed them their place in it. A warrior might glimpse his own death, not with terror but with grim satisfaction, knowing he'd die sword in hand. A mother might see her children fleeing a burning village, yet leave the ritual with her head high, already planning how to teach them survival. But the mead's power came at a cost. Some seers lost days to its grip, returning hollow-eyed and gaunt, their voices rough from screaming warnings no one fully understood. Others developed a dependence, craving the visions like food, their bodies wasting away as their minds drifted further from the living world. And then there were those who poured the mead but never drank, wise enough to know that some futures are better faced unspoiled. The legacy of this ritual lingers in our very language. The word berserk likely stems from bare shirt, a nod to warriors who may have consumed similar brews before battle, their minds lost in animalistic fury. Even the mead halls of later sagas, where heroes boasted and feasted, carry echoes of those sacred cauldrons, a reminder that for the Vikings, intoxication wasn't just for celebration. Sometimes it was the only way to stare into the abyss and come back with answers. In the deep forests of Scandinavia, where moonlight barely pierced the thick canopy, Viking seers practiced a ritual as chilling as it was cunning, the art of shadow binding. To the Norse, a shadow wasn't just an absence of light. It was a fragment of the soul itself, a piece of a person's essence that could be captured, twisted, or even destroyed. Imagine the scene: a völva crouched beside an ancient oak, her knife glinting as she traced the outline of an enemy's shadow onto the bark, her whispers weaving spells into every cut. By sunrise, that silhouette would harden into a prison, binding the victim's fate to the tree's roots. The timing was deliberate. Midnight, the moment between one day and the next, was when the veil between worlds grew thin. The seer would wait until her target's shadow stretched long and distorted in the flickering torchlight, then carve swiftly, ensuring no break in the line. Any gap could let the soul escape. Some accounts describe völvas using blood mixed with crushed owl bones to darken the etching, a grisly ink to seal the magic. The tree's species mattered too. Ash, sacred to Yggdrasil, amplified the binding's power, while rowan, known for its protective qualities, could turn the curse back on the caster if handled carelessly. But why go to such lengths? Shadow binding wasn't just about vengeance, it was control. A chieftain might order the ritual to cripple a rival's luck before a duel, or a mother might seek it to silence a slanderer's tongue. The effects were said to be slow but insidious. The bound person might wither without illness, their strength leaching away as the tree's roots drank their shadow's essence. One saga tells of a warrior who collapsed mid-battle, his limbs suddenly heavy as if dragged by invisible chains, only for his companions to find his silhouette carved into a trunk leagues away. Not all shadows were taken from living foes. Some seers collected the shadows of the recently deceased, etching them into groves as a way to commune with the dead. These shadow groves became places of pilgrimage where the living could whisper questions to the bark and wait for answers in the rustle of leaves. But the practice had its risks. A shadow bound too tightly might fester, causing the tree to rot from within, a sign the spirit was fighting back, and if the tree fell. The sagas warn of freed shadows rising like smoke, seeking their original owners or latching onto the nearest living host. What's haunting is how this ritual reveals the Norse understanding of connection. To them, every person was tied to the world in ways both seen and unseen, through breath, through fate, and yes, through shadows. The völvas didn't just carve bark, they carved consequences, a reminder that even the airiest parts of the soul could be anchored to earth. And in those moonlit forests, the trees stood as silent witnesses, their trunks heavy with the weight of stolen shades. The raven wasn't just a bird to the Viking seers, it was a winged messenger, a feathered cipher carrying whispers from the gods themselves. Perched on the mast of a longship or circling high above a battlefield, its flight patterns held secrets only the trained could unravel. Picture a völva standing atop a windswept cliff, her eyes locked on the black speck cutting through the gray sky. Every dip, every turn of those ink-dark wings was a letter in some celestial alphabet. A raven flying east at dawn might herald prosperous trade, while one croaking 3 times before veering west could signal betrayal. The seers didn't just watch, they listened. The pitch of the caws, the rhythm, even the way the bird preened mid-flight could shift a prophecy's meaning entirely. But the raven's call rituals weren't passive observations. Seers actively courted these omens, scattering offerings of fish bones or shiny trinkets to draw the birds closer. Some accounts speak of völvas wearing raven feather cloaks, believing the garb lent them kinship with the creatures, sharpening their ability to interpret the flights. The sagas brim with eerie accuracy. A seer in Iceland once halted a chieftain's voyage after spotting 2 ravens colliding mid-air, a sign so dire the entire crew mutinied. Weeks later, news arrived that the planned route had been ambushed by rivals. To dismiss the raven's guidance was to ignore Odin's own spies, for the Allfather's twin ravens, Hugin and Munin, were the original masters of this aerial divination. Under the cold glow of the moon, another ritual unfolded, one where darkness wasn't just a backdrop but an active ingredient. The moonlit runes demanded more than carving, they required celestial alignment. The völva would wait for specific phases, waxing for growth, waning for banishment, full for revelation before etching symbols into bone, wood, or stone. The moonlight wasn't merely light, it was a kind of alchemy, a liquid that seeped into the runes, charging them with potency. Each phase carried its own rules. A rune of protection carved under a new moon might falter, its power diluted by the absent glow, while a curse inscribed during a blood moon could fester uncontrollably, like a wound that refused to close. The materials mattered as much as the timing. Birchwood, pale as the moon itself, was favored for healing runes, while oak, stubborn and strong, lent its might to spells of endurance. Some seers mixed crushed luminescent minerals into the carving grooves, so the runes would glow faintly in the dark, a physical echo of the moon's touch. But the true art lay in the silence. Unlike the raven's call, which thrived on sound and motion, the moonlit runes demanded stillness. A single misstroke, a slip of the knife, and the völva would have to wait another cycle to try again, the moon's patience as unyielding as the gods themselves. What ties these two rituals together is their symbiosis with forces beyond human control. The ravens obeyed no master, and the moon paid no heed to mortal schedules. The seers didn't command these elements, they conversed with them, interpreting a language written in wings and shadows. It's a humbling reminder that for all their power, the völvas knew their place not as rulers of the unseen, but as its students, forever decoding the world's hidden whispers. The dead could walk. This wasn't just superstition to the Vikings, but a very real fear woven into their rituals. Among the most unsettling practices was the binding of corpses, a desperate act to keep restless spirits from clawing their way back into the world of the living. Picture this, a slain warrior laid out on a burial slab, his toes meticulously tied together with red woolen thread, each knot sealed with a drop of beeswax and a whispered rune. To the untrained eye, it might look like simple preparation for the afterlife, but to the seers who performed it, this was a leash on the soul itself. The sagas overflow with warnings of the untethered dead. A man murdered without justice, a woman wronged in life. These were the spirits most likely to return, their anger festering beyond the grave. The thread, often dyed with iron-rich bog water to strengthen its symbolic ties to the earth, acted as both shackle and safeguard. Icelandic accounts describe families rushing to bind their loved ones' corpses after violent deaths, terrified that unchecked vengeance might twist the deceased into a draugr, a reanimated corpse with strength enough to crush living bones. One particularly chilling tale tells of a chieftain whose toe threads rotted away too soon. Within nights, his phantom was spotted stalking his killer's homestead, the floors creaking under unseen steps until the murderer fled screaming into the snow. But the ritual wasn't just about restraint. The choice of materials held layers of meaning. Red thread, the color of blood, invoked the bonds of kinship, a plea to the dead, remember whose you are. Beeswax, pliable yet enduring, symbolized the flexibility of memory, honoring the departed without letting their rage consume the living. Some seers even wove human hair into the threads, often from the corpse's closest relative, as if to say, I hold you still. The sagas note that these bindings were never permanent. The threads were meant to decay naturally, releasing the spirit once its mortal grievances had faded. What's striking is how this practice reveals the Vikings' nuanced relationship with death. They didn't just fear the dead, they respected their agency. A bound corpse wasn't a prisoner, but a storm temporarily anchored, and in those taut, careful knots, the living and the dead reached an uneasy truce, the promise that some wounds, even fatal ones, could be healed with time and ritual. Until then, the threads held thin, trembling but unbroken. The flames danced like living things, twisting and leaping in ways that defied the wind, because this was no ordinary fire. To the Viking Seers, the ritual of fire visions was a gateway to the end of all things, a chance to stare into the embers and witness Ragnarök itself unfolding in the smoke. They built their bonfires with meticulous care, layering oak and ash wood for stability, then topping them with fistfuls of sacred herbs, mugwort for its mind-altering properties, yarrow for protection, and sometimes a pinch of henbane to blur the lines between worlds. As the flames roared, the völva would crouch so close the heat blistered her skin, her unblinking gaze fixed on the shapes writhing in the inferno. The visions came in fragments at first, a wolf's snarling jaw forming in the sparks, a ship made of fingernails rising from the coals. But as the herbs took hold, the images grew sharper, more insistent. Some seers described watching the great serpent Jörmungandr rise from the sea, its scales glinting like 1,000 daggers in the firelight. Others saw the rainbow bridge bifrost shatter under the weight of marching dead, or the sun swallowed whole by the gaping maw of Skoll. These weren't just hallucinations. To the Norse, they were previews of an inevitable future, flashes of destiny stolen from the flames. What's fascinating is how these rituals mirrored Slavic traditions across the Baltic. Slavic Volkovs, their own seers, practiced similar fire-gazing rites, using herbs like wormwood and fern to induce visions of Perun's battles or Veel's trickery. Both cultures shared a belief that fire wasn't merely an element, it was a living oracle, its flickering tongue speaking the language of gods and doom. Some scholars speculate these practices stemmed from an even older Indo-European tradition, a shared ancestral reverence for the transformative power of flame. But the Viking seers took it further. Unlike the Slavs, who often sought practical guidance when to plant crops, where to hunt, the Norse völvas deliberately courted apocalyptic visions. They wanted to see the world's end, to stand unflinching before the chaos that would one day consume them all. It was a form of spiritual hardening, like a warrior training for battle by walking through burning embers barefoot. The aftermath of these rituals was just as telling. Those who'd peered deepest into the fire often returned changed, their voices roughened by smoke, their eyes slow to readjust to the sunlight. Some refused to speak of what they'd seen for days, as if the words might summon the visions prematurely. Others scrawled frantic runes onto birch bark, their messages cryptic. The wolf's shadow grows longer, or the golden rooster has not yet crowed. Perhaps most striking is how these fire rituals reveal the Viking mindset. Where others might shy from prophecies of doom, the seers sought them, stared them down, and emerged, not with despair but with a grim resolve. To know the end was coming didn't paralyze them, it sharpened them. Every vision of Ragnarök was a reminder, live fiercely while the fire still burns. A chieftain's hall fell silent as the silver ring glinted in the firelight. Its surface streaked dark with fresh blood. This was no mere ornament, but a weapon of truth. Viking law wasn't written on parchment, it was sworn on the oath ring, a ritual so binding that even the gods were said to witness its weight. When disputes arose over stolen cattle, contested land, or broken alliances, the accused would grasp this sacred circle, their fingers slicking red as they vowed innocence or guilt. To lie with blood on the ring wasn't just perjury, it was an invitation for the cosmos itself to exact punishment. The ring's power came from its dual nature. Crafted from silver, a metal tied to the moon's cool judgment, it was often kept in temples or draped around the necks of idols, absorbing centuries of solemn oaths. But the blood, usually from a sacrificial boar or goat, was the spark that awakened its fury. As the swearer's palm closed around the sticky metal, the seer presiding would chant a litany of consequences, crops withering, ships sinking, lineages crumbling if the oath proved false. Some accounts describe rings that grew hot to the touch when clasped by deceitful hands, searing the skin as if the metal itself rebelled. What's fascinating is how this ritual blurred the lines between law and magic. In a society without prisons or written contracts, the oath ring became a living courtroom. A man accused of theft might swear on it, then walk free, only to drown in a sudden squall months later, his death seen as the ring's delayed verdict. Women, often excluded from other legal processes, could demand their husbands or sons swear on the ring to settle domestic disputes, their testimony suddenly carrying divine weight. Even kings weren't immune. Saga after saga tells of rulers whose reigns unraveled after breaking rings' sworn promises, their kingdoms plagued by famine or revolt as if cursed by the very words they'd uttered. Archaeology hints at the ring's terrifying reach. At a Swedish temple site, researchers uncovered a silver ring fused to a shattered human jawbone, perhaps evidence of an oath gone horribly wrong. Another, found in Norway, bore runes that translated to "I keep what I promise" or "the earth keeps me." But the most chilling detail, many oath rings were deliberately bent or nicked after use, a physical distortion mirroring the cosmic imbalance a broken vow would trigger. This ritual's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern Scandinavian courts may not use bloodied silver, but witnesses still place a hand on a Bible, a faint echo of that ancient visceral pact. The Vikings understood something we've since diluted. Words alone are fragile, but words sealed in blood and metal, those could shape destinies. There was no such thing as an ordinary night's sleep for a Viking seer, not when dreams could be portals to the future. Enter the dream pillow, a deceptively simple sack of fabric stuffed with herbs so potent they could twist the fabric of sleep itself into a tapestry of prophecy. These weren't the plush cushions of royalty, they were rough linen pouches filled with mistletoe, henbane, and vervain, their aromas thick enough to drag the mind into visions. Picture a Volva lying down after days of fasting, her head sinking into a pillow that smelled of earth and decay, her breath slowing as the herbs slithered into her lungs. By midnight, her eyelids would flutter not with rest but with revelation. The choice of herbs was no accident. Mistletoe, sacred to the Norse for its ability to grow without roots, symbolized the seer's own untethered consciousness during these dream journeys. Henbane, with its narcotic properties, blurred the line between sleep and trance, while vervain, a plant linked to clairvoyance in countless cultures, sharpened the visions into something almost tangible. Some accounts mention pillows lined with animal skins, particularly fox or wolf, as if the wearer could borrow the creature's cunning or ferocity in the dreamscape. The most powerful dream pillows were said to be stuffed under a new moon and first used under a full one, their potency peaking when lunar energy was at its height. And the visions they provoked chillingly precise. One saga recounts a völva who dreamed of a bloody axe lodged in a doorframe, a detail so vivid. She warned a chieftain to refuse entry to any stranger carrying an axe for a month. He laughed until a visiting trader, axe strapped to his back, tried to murder him in his sleep. Another seer woke gasping from a pillow-induced dream of a sinking ship, its sails embroidered with a distinctive knot pattern. When a fleet returned weeks later with news of a storm drowning one vessel, the sole survivor described those very knots moments before the waves took it. But the ritual wasn't just about passive observation. Some völvas trained themselves to steer their dreams, using whispered runes before sleep to direct the visions toward specific questions. Where is the lost herd? Who plots against the Jarl? The herbs grease the hinges of the subconscious, but the seers will force the door open. This skill was honed over years. Apprentices started with milder blends, graduating to pillows so potent they risked never waking fully, their minds adrift in the dream world forever. What's striking is how these pillows reveal the Vikings' pragmatism. They didn't wait for prophecy to come to them, they stuffed it into sackcloth and slept on it. And in those hazy hours between midnight and dawn, the future wasn't just seen, it was felt in the prick of mistletoe through thin linen, in the bitter taste of henbane lingering on the tongue. For the seers, sleep wasn't an escape, it was the deepest dive into reality they could take. The horses knew when death was near, their ears twitching at whispers no living human could hear. Viking seers paid close attention to these creatures, especially when they grazed near burial mounds or temple sites. There, the animals became unwitting messengers between worlds, their sudden snorts or uneasy stomps decoded as omens by watchful völvas. This practice, known as the horse whispers ritual, turned ordinary steeds into bridges to the underworld. A horse that refused to cross a certain patch of earth might be standing over a restless grave. One that reared without warning could be reacting to the brush of a spirit's hand against its flank. But the most telling sign was a particular kind of neigh, high-pitched, shuddering, as if the creature had been startled by something just beyond sight. Seers would note the direction of the horse's gaze, the way its nostrils flared, even the number of times it shook its mane. Every detail held clues about what or who was trying to speak from the other side. The rituals surrounding these moments were precise. A völva might anoint the horse's ears with a paste of crushed mushrooms and honey, believed to sharpen its ability to detect spirits. Others tied tiny iron bells to the animal's bridle, the metal's purity thought to repel malevolent forces while allowing benevolent voices through. The sagas tell of a chieftain who ignored his seer's warning after a horse screamed bloody murder near his son's freshly dug grave. Days later, the boy's ghost appeared in the stable, his spectral fingers tangled in the same horse's mane, a silent accusation that the dead had been wronged. But if the horse whispers were a subtle conversation with the afterlife, the gate of hell ritual was a battering ram against its doors. Seers who needed direct answers, not hints from skittish animals, turned to this terrifying practice. Armed with an iron staff, often etched with runes of compulsion, the völva would strike the ground at a crossroads or the mouth of a cave, each thunderous blow mimicking the hammer falls of the gods. Iron, with its ties to both weaponry and the earth's core, was thought to weaken the barriers between realms. As the staff struck, the seer would chant the names of the dead she wished to summon, her voice growing hoarse from repetition. The accounts of what followed are harrowing. Some describe a sudden drop in temperature, the breath of participants frosting in midsummer air. Others speak of a hollow booming sound, as if something massive were stirring deep underground. The bravest or most foolhardy völvas claim to see the ground itself ripple like water, a glimpse of hell's shadowy realm flickering beneath their feet. But this ritual was never without risk. The sagas warn of seers who struck too hard, too eagerly, and found themselves yanked downward by unseen hands, their staffs left abandoned on the dirt as a warning. What unites these rituals is their raw desperation. The horse whispers were a plea for gentle guidance, a way to let the dead speak through nature's interpreters. The gate of hell was a demand, a seer's defiant refusal to accept silence. Together, they reveal a culture that saw death not as an ending, but as a negotiation, one where the living could still shout their questions into the dark and hope against all odds for an answer. The screams weren't just agony, they were prophecy. Among the most hotly debated rituals of Viking seers was the blood eagle augury, a practice so brutal that modern scholars still wrestle with its reality. Imagine the scene: a condemned man, often a captured enemy or oath breaker, bound face down as the executioner's blade traced the outline of an eagle across his back. Ribs were wrenched outward like wings, lungs exposed to the frigid air, and as the victim's shrieks echoed across the cliffs, the völva would tilt her head, listening not for pain but for patterns. A guttural wail that rose and fell in 3 sharp pitches might signal an approaching storm. A strangled gasp followed by silence could warn of betrayal within the chieftain's inner circle. The seers claimed the dying man's breaths carried fragments of the future, his suffering a distorted lens through which the gods spoke. But did this ritual truly exist, or was it a nightmare spun from saga poets' imaginations? The debate rages. Skeptics point to the lack of concrete archaeological evidence. No mass graves show the specific rib damage described in accounts. Others argue the blood eagle's prominence in later Christian texts paints it as propaganda, a grotesque exaggeration meant to demonize pagan practices. Yet tantalizing clues suggest a kernel of truth. A 9th century skaldic poem references a screaming eagle as an omen before battle, while runestones in Denmark depict stylized eagles with human figures beneath, perhaps symbolic, perhaps literal. Even the logistics hint at plausibility. Norse seers were known to interpret bird flights and animal entrails. Why not the death throes of a man transformed through ritual into a living sacrifice? The sagas themselves offer conflicting testimony. In one version, a victim's final cry predicts a king's death within the year, a prophecy fulfilled to the day. Another dismisses the whole practice as theater for weak-minded lords, implying some seers staged it for shock value rather than genuine divination. What's undeniable is the ritual's psychological power. Whether real or myth, the blood eagle augury forced witnesses to confront a harrowing idea. That truth might be carved from suffering, that destiny could sound less like a whisper and more like a scream. Perhaps the most chilling detail comes from an Icelandic account where a captured warrior laughs through the agony, his breaths forming words no one present had taught him, an unknown language later identified by a traveling cleric as perfect Latin. His last gasp, vidit venet tempus, behold the time comes. The seer who heard it reportedly went mad within months, chewing her own lips raw to silence the phrase looping in her mind. Whether fact or fabrication, the story lingers like smoke from a sacrificial pyre, forcing us to wonder, even if the blood eagle was rare, what drove the Vikings to believe such a horror could unveil the future? The answer may lie not in the brutality, but in their unshakable conviction that every boundary between life and death, pain and prophecy existed to be crossed. The first winter moon wasn't just a sign of cold nights ahead. It was a night of hunger's shadow when famine spirits crept closest to the living. The frost moon chant was the Viking Seers' answer to this unseen threat, a melody so haunting it could freeze malevolent forces in their tracks. Picture the scene, villagers huddled in the flickering glow of a bonfire, their breath misting in the icy air as the völva raised her voice in a song that wasn't quite music, more like a spell woven from sound. The chant didn't rhyme or follow familiar rhythms. It rose and fell in jagged intervals, mimicking the howl of wind through barren branches. Archaeologists poring over medieval Icelandic texts have pieced together fragments of these melodies, their notation sparse but chillingly effective. One reconstructed phrase dips suddenly into a whisper, then leaps to a piercing high note, a deliberate sonic spike meant to startle lurking spirits into retreat. The lyrics, where they survive, reveal a desperate bargaining with nature. Lines like "iron teeth, frost lips, turn away from our stores," or "3 roots left, 1 for the dead, 2 for the living," weren't poetry, they were survival arithmetic. The seers understood famine wasn't just bad luck, it was a force with a voice, and to counter it, they needed a sound just as primal. Some chants included the snapping of frozen twigs underfoot, the crunching time to the beat, as if to say, even the ground itself rejects you. Others wove in the distant calls of ravens, nature's own omens, blurring the line between human song and the wild. What's striking is how these chants varied by region. In Norway's deep fjords, where winters were longest, the melodies stretched into droning, repetitive loops meant to fatigue the spirits into leaving. Danish versions, by contrast, were sharper and shorter, like a command barked at a prowling wolf. But the most eerie were the Greenlandic frost moon chants, reconstructed from 13th century settlers' accounts. These incorporated the groaning of sea ice, a sound so unnatural. It was believed to confuse famine spirits, making them lose their way in the auditory maze. The rituals surrounding the chant were just as deliberate. The völva would often stand barefoot in the snow, her toes numbing as she sang, a physical sacrifice to prove her sincerity. Some accounts mention participants holding chunks of frozen soil, their fingers aching against the cold, the discomfort a shared offering to ward off greater suffering. And then there were the pauses, those moments of sudden silence mid-chant where the only sound was the crackling fire. These weren't mistakes, they were traps, lulling the spirits into thinking the song had ended before the völva's voice slammed back, louder, as if to say, "We're still here. And we're still fighting." Modern experiments with these reconstructed chants yield uncanny results. When musicologists performed them in a controlled acoustic setting, listeners reported an involuntary tightening in their chests, a sensation of cold creeping up their spines, even in warm rooms. It's proof that the Viking Seers didn't just sing about winter, they channeled its very essence, turning sound into a weapon against the unseen. And on those long-ago nights with starvation looming, that weapon may have been all that stood between a village and the abyss. The shallow grave held no body, only a ship no longer than a man's arm, its wooden hull blackened by ritual fire. Inside, carefully arranged around a carved figurehead, lay 9 tiny iron men with shields, their faces turned toward the bow as if ready to row into eternity. This was no child's toy, but a vessel for the unseen, the ship of the dead, one of the most poignant rituals Viking Seers performed to shepherd lost souls to the afterlife. When a warrior fell too far from home to be buried properly, or when a body couldn't be recovered from battle or sea, the völva would craft these miniature longships as spiritual lifeboats, each detail charged with meaning. The number of oarsmen mirrored the crew of a real warship. The burnt hull symbolized both destruction and rebirth, just as fire cleared fields for new growth. And the figurehead, often a snarling beast or a goddess with empty eyes, acted as a guide through the misty waters of the afterlife, its gaze fixed on Valhalla's golden halls. The discovery of the Oseberg ship in Norway in 1904 offers stunning physical evidence of how these rituals scaled up for the elite. Buried around 834, this 70-foot-long vessel held the remains of 2 women, one possibly a völva, surrounded by sledges, tapestries, and even sacrificed horses. But it's the smaller artifacts that whisper of everyday spiritual practice. A bucket carved with cats, Freyja's sacred animals, a wooden cart with serpentine handles, a vehicle for the afterlife journey, and most tellingly, 5 exquisitely carved animal heads, their expressions alternating between fury and serenity. Scholars believe these were interchangeable figureheads for a ritual ship, swapped out depending on which god's protection was sought, a grandiose cousin to the seers' miniature burials. What's haunting is how these ships reflect the Vikings' geography of death. To a people who lived by the sea, the afterlife wasn't just a destination, it was a voyage. The sagas describe fallen warriors sailing to Valhalla, their ships crewed by Valkyries rather than mortals. For those denied a proper burial at sea, the miniature ships became symbolic substitutes, their tiny oars churning invisible waves. Some were buried at crossroads, acting as spiritual ferries where the dead could board. Others were placed in bogs, the water serving as a portal to the underworld. A few, like those found near Reykjavik, contained scraps of wool or hair stand-ins for the missing body, as if the seer had anchored part of the soul to the vessel with these tangible fragments. The rituals varied by circumstance. A ship for a drowned fisherman might include miniature nets carved from reeds, while a warrior's could hold a tiny axe or sword no bigger than a fingernail. Some völvas added cargo, like minuscule amber beads representing sunstones, tools the dead might need to navigate the afterlife's murky skies. The most elaborate examples, like ones excavated near Uppsala, even had microscopic runes etched along the keel, spells to ward off restless spirits who might try commandeering the ship for darker purposes. Perhaps the most moving detail comes from a child's grave in Denmark, where archaeologists found a ship barely the length of a hand, its sail stitched from a scrap of linen still bearing a faint bloodstain. The seer who prepared it had pressed the child's fingertip into the clay hull, leaving a wall of fingerprints beside the figurehead, a final touch, as if to say, "This vessel is yours alone." In that tiny boat, we see the Vikings' raw humanity, a people who could raid monasteries without remorse, yet poured equal fierceness into ensuring even their smallest lost ones wouldn't drift alone in the dark. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like just another fur hat, but the veil of the Volva was anything but ordinary. Woven from the pelts of cats, often with strips of sinew threaded between the patches to keep the spirits bound within, this headdress wasn't just for warmth. It was a crown of power, a living link to Freyja herself. The Norse goddess rode a chariot pulled by two massive cats, creatures said to have been gifted by Thor himself, their claws sharp enough to tear through the fabric between worlds. When a seer donned her feline veil, she wasn't just accessorizing. She was slipping into the skin of Freyja's sacred beasts, borrowing their sight to peer beyond the mortal veil. The choice of cat fur wasn't accidental. Domestic cats were rare in Viking settlements, their presence often tied to trade or raids, making their pelts precious. But beyond scarcity, these animals carried mythic weight. Cats moved silently between realms in Norse lore, slinking through villages by day, vanishing into forests by night, their eyes gleaming like trapped moonlight. A völva's veil mimicked this duality, the fur bristling as if alive during trances, the strands standing on end when spirits drew near. Some sagas describe seers whose veils seemed to hiss during rituals, the fur rippling without wind, as if the goddess's chariot beasts were stirring beneath the skins. The construction of these veils was its own ritual. The cats weren't hunted, they were offered, their deaths timed to the waning moon so their souls would linger close, tethered to the fur. The seer would stitch each pelt with bone needles, chanting prayers to Freyja with every puncture. Finished veils often dangled with tiny bronze bells or carved amulets shaped like claws, creating a soft jingle meant to mimic the sound of Freyja's chariot approaching from the spirit world. But the veil's power came with peril. To wear it recklessly was to risk Freyja's jealousy, a goddess known for her capriciousness. One Icelandic account tells of a Volva who boasted her veil could summon storms. When she donned it without proper offerings, the cats whose pelts she wore allegedly woke, their unseen claws raking her scalp until she tore the headdress away, her hair streaked white where the spirits had touched. What's striking is how this ritual reflects the Vikings' view of clothing as more than fabric. A warrior's cloak might bear his luck, but a seer's veil carried her connection to the divine. And in those patches of fur, stitched with care and charged with prayer, the Volvas found a truth modern minds often forget. Sometimes to see the unseen, you must dress the part. The weight of a curse could be measured in stone specifically, in the grooves carved into palm-sized rocks, each one a vessel for vengeance. Viking seers didn't just hurl insults at their enemies. They etched their fury into runes, then sent those curses hurtling downhill, gathering momentum as the stones tumbled toward their targets. This was no symbolic gesture. The act of rolling was the spark that lit the curse's fuse. Picture a Volva standing atop a windswept slope in the Hebrides, her hands cradling a stone chilled by the mist, its surface scored with jagged runes spelling out a chieftain's downfall. With a whispered oath, she'd release it, watching as the rock bounced and skidded, each impact against the earth amplifying the malice woven into its grooves. The farther it rolled, the deeper the curse sank into the fabric of fate. Archaeologists have unearthed these cursing stones from Scotland to Norway, but the most chilling examples survive in the Hebrides, where Norse settlers left behind rocks carved with phrases like "May his ships never find wind," or "Let her womb wither like winter grass." The runes weren't merely inscribed, they were charged, often smeared with blood or bile to bind the curse to its victim. Some stones bear tiny depressions where the seer's thumb would rest, a physical anchor point for their focus as they channeled their rage into the rock. The choice of material mattered too. Sandstone, soft enough to carve but tough enough to survive the roll, was favored for its duality, malleable in the seer's hands, unyielding against the enemy's luck. But the ritual wasn't just about destruction. The direction of the roll held meaning. A stone sent eastward might target a rival's livelihood, while one rolled west could afflict their health. The slope's steepness dictated the curse's speed. A gentle incline might doom a family over generations, while a sheer drop promised swift ruin. And then there were the stopping points. A stone caught in a thicket signaled interference from spirits, while one that plunged into water meant the curse would drown its victim in relentless misfortune. The psychological toll was as potent as the supernatural claim. Imagine hearing your enemy had rolled a stone against you, knowing its path mirrored your impending unraveling. Some victims reportedly sought out the stones to break the curse, smashing them with hammers or tossing them into fires, a desperate bid to shatter the spell before it took root. Few succeeded. The sagas tell of a merchant who found his cursing stone and buried it beneath his threshold, only for his house to collapse months later, the walls crumbling as if the earth itself rejected his defiance. What's fascinating is how these stones reveal the Vikings' belief in kinetic magic, the idea that motion could transmute intention into reality. A rolled stone wasn't just a message to the gods, it was a weapon launched along the contours of the land, its trajectory a physical manifestation of fated ruin. And in those grooves and gashes, we see a culture that understood the weight of words literally. To carve a curse was one thing, but to set it rolling, that was an act of irrevocable consequence. The longhouse tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar and honeyed bread, yet half the seats stood empty, their plates filled but untouched. This was the ancestor feast, a midnight ritual where Viking Seers blurred the line between the living and the dead. As the winter winds rattled the roof beams, the völva would place a steaming cut of meat before a vacant stool, whispering the names of departed kin into the hearth's glow. The first bite of every dish was laid on these spirit plates, the steam curling upward like ethereal hands reaching to taste. But the true magic came in the silence that followed, the creak of a bench shifting under unseen weight, the sudden chill near the mead horn, the way the flames bent toward the empty seats as if acknowledging guests only the seer could see. These weren't random spirits being summoned. The völva called specific ancestors, a grandmother known for her prophetic dreams, a warrior uncle whose death went unavenged, their presence sought for guidance. The sagas tell of feasts where spilled ale formed rune-like shapes on the table, or where a knife left balanced on a spirit plate was found embedded in the wood by dawn, as if an invisible hand had slammed it down in emphasis. One account describes a seer's sleeve tugging sharply during the meal, dragging her toward a particular empty chair where the air smelled inexplicably of pine tar, the calling card of a shipbuilder ancestor warning of rotten timbers in the chieftain's new longship. While the ancestor feast transformed the dining hall into a crossroads between worlds, the hollow oak ritual took communion with nature to even eerier depths. Deep in the forest, seers sought out ancient oaks with cavernous trunks, not just any trees, but those struck by lightning or hollowed by age, their scars mimicking the wounds of Yggdrasil, the world tree itself. Into these living vaults, völvas placed offerings, rune-carved bones, locks of hair from the deceased, even tiny silver figurines representing gods. The oak wasn't merely a hiding spot, it was a conduit. The Norse believed these hollows were literal doorways, their knotted interiors leading not to empty space, but to the roots of the cosmos. The placement rituals were exacting. An offering for healing would be tucked into north-facing hollows, where the shade kept the objects cool like a wound poultice. Curses went into east-facing cavities, ensuring the morning sun would cook the malice into potency. But the most sacred were upward-facing hollows, those rare openings where rainwater collected in natural bowls. Here, seers deposited miniature silver ships or carved ravens, believing these vessels would carry prayers upward along the tree's branches straight to Asgard's halls. What unites these rituals is their intimacy with absence. The ancestor feast celebrated the invisible presences at the table, while the hollow oak reveled in the unseen world within the wood. Both acknowledge the Vikings' most profound belief. that what we cannot see is often what shapes us most, and in those midnight meals and tree-carved portals, the seers didn't just honor the hidden, they dared to dine and bargain with it. The cliffs didn't just echo, they answered. In the hushed twilight before dawn, Viking seers would stand before gaping cave mouths or wind-scarred bluffs, their voices roar from chanting as they shouted questions into the stone. The reverberations that returned weren't mere repetitions. To the völvas, they were the gods whispering through geology. This was the echo spell, a ritual where nature itself became an oracle, its distortions and delays passed like runes. Norway's legendary trolls' echo sites, where sound bounces unnaturally between rock faces, were sacred to these practices. One particular cliff in Hjornfjord was said to twist whispers into coherent sentences if you knew how to listen. The ritual demanded precision. The seer's question had to be phrased as a single, unbroken shout, no hesitations, no trailing off because the echo's clarity determined the prophecy's strength. A clean rebound might signal approval from the gods, while a fragmented response warned of obstacles ahead. Some völvas cupped their hands around their mouths, shaping the sound like a potter molding clay, while others stood barefoot on specific moss-covered stones believed to amplify spiritual resonance. The timing was equally crucial. Dawn and dusk, those liminal moments between day and night, were favored, as were the solstices, when the sun's angle allegedly thinned the veil between worlds. But the true art lay in interpretation. A quick, sharp echo might mean yes, while a drawn-out, warbling return could indicate hidden dangers. At the Troll's Echo in Averoy, legend says a seer once asked if her village should relocate only for the rocks to send back her words in reverse, a disorienting omen the villagers took as a command to stay put. Months later, a landslide buried the neighboring valley, sparing their homes. Other accounts describe echoes that returned louder than the original shout, as if the gods were shouting over the seer's shoulder, or ones that arrived seconds late, like a delayed verdict from the cosmos. The geology of these sites lent the rituals an eerie credibility. Sea caves along the Norwegian coast, carved by centuries of waves, created natural sound chambers where whispers could travel hundreds of feet without fading. Inland, narrow fjords acted like stone megaphones, bouncing cries between cliffs until they morphed into something unrecognizable, perhaps even supernatural. Modern acoustic studies of these locations reveal startling phenomena. Certain frequencies amplify unpredictably, while others cancel out entirely, creating gaps of silence mid-echo. To the Norse, this wasn't physics, it was the land itself editing divine messages. What's haunting is how these rituals reveal the Vikings' relationship with their environment. They didn't just inhabit the landscape, they conversed with it, treating the Earth's voice as an active participant in their spiritual lives. And in those distorted echoes, they found a truth science now echoes. Sometimes the most profound answers come when we stop speaking and let the world speak back. The dead don't speak for free, even in the afterlife. The Vikings believed prophecy had a price. Enter the Silver Eyes ritual, where seers placed shimmering coins over the eyelids of corpses, a final transaction between the living and the departed. These weren't ordinary payments. The coins were deliberately chosen silver for its purity, its cold sheen mirroring the pallor of death itself. Picture a völva leaning over a chieftain's freshly wrapped corpse, pressing 2 discs of precious metal onto his closed eyes as she whispered, "Speak plainly and keep your sight." The message was clear. This was no gift but a bribe to the spirit, ensuring its vision remained sharp in the afterlife and its warnings uncorrupted by the haze of death. Archaeologists digging near Ribe, Denmark, uncovered the most striking evidence of this practice: a warrior's grave from the 8th century. His skeletal face still cradling 2 oval silver pieces etched with tiny, spiraling runes. The inscriptions weren't monetary values but pleas, guide us on one, see true on the other. Forensic analysis revealed something eerie. The coins bore microscopic scratches as if gripped by tense fingers before placement. Had the seer hesitated, weighing the risk of a prophecy gone awry? Or had the dead man's family added their own pleas to the metal, layering desperation into the silver? The ritual's logic was razor-sharp. Silver, sacred to the moon goddess Mani, was thought to reflect not light but truth. By covering the eyes, the body's most expressive feature, the seer effectively turned them into mirrors, repelling any deceit the spirit might carry. Some accounts describe völvas using coins minted with Odin's likeness, his one-eyed gaze a safeguard against half-truths. Others preferred blank discs, believing the dead would imprint their visions onto the pristine surface, leaving faint markings only the seer could decipher. Timing was critical. The coins had to be placed after the final breath, but before rigor mortis set in, during the fleeting window when the soul was still straddling worlds. A coin applied too late might reach a spirit already lost to hell's halls. Too early, and the dying person's fear could taint the prophecy. The sagas tell of a völva who slipped the silver onto a wounded warrior's eyes moments before death, only for the man to jolt upright, his corpse hissing through clenched teeth. The payment is short. The village collapsed into famine within the year, as if the underpaid dead had cursed them with withheld knowledge. But not all silver eyes rituals were dire. Some were tender. In a child's grave near Hedeby, excavators found a single coin, cut in half with shears, a poignant gesture, perhaps acknowledging the little one's incomplete life. The cut was clean, deliberate, as if to say, we give what we can. And in that fragile half-moon of silver, we see the Vikings' unshakable pragmatism. Even grief had its economy, and every prophecy, no matter how heartbreaking, demanded its due. The drum's rhythm wasn't just sound, it was a rope thrown into the storm's chaos, a desperate attempt to lasso the wind itself. Viking seers wielded the storm drum with hands calloused from years of practice, their palms striking the reindeer hide surface in patterns so precise they could allegedly split thunderheads like an axe through wood. Picture the scene: a völva perched on a seaside cliff, her drum strapped to one hand, its beater clutched in the other as black clouds boiled on the horizon. The tempo started slow, matching the distant thunder's growl, then accelerated, twisting the natural cadence, forcing the storm to dance to the seer's rhythm rather than its own. This wasn't mere music, it was weather warfare, a sonic tug of war between human will and elemental fury. The drum's construction held secrets. Its frame, often carved from birch struck by lightning, wood already baptized by the sky's rage, was believed to carry residual storm energy. The hide, preferably from a reindeer that had survived a blizzard, was thought to remember resilience, its fibers tightening or loosening with atmospheric changes. But the true power lay in the symbols painted across the drumhead. Spirals representing wind funnels, zigzags mimicking lightning's path, even tiny boats to guide lost sailors through the tumult. Some drums had adjustable weights tied to strings beneath the surface. Shifting these could alter the pitch mid-ritual, creating dissonance to repel hail or harmonious tones to summon cleansing rains. The Sami influence on this practice was undeniable. Indigenous shamans of the far north had been taming blizzards with drums for centuries before Viking seers adopted and adapted their techniques. Where Sami Noidi drummers used the instrument primarily to navigate spiritual realms, Viking völvas weaponized it, bending those same rhythms to physically redirect storms. Archaeological finds along old trade routes reveal hybrid drums, Sami-style frames decorated with Norse runes, a fusion of two worldviews clashing and merging like the weather systems they sought to control. Even the striking patterns borrowed from Sami tradition, the reindeer trot for gentle rains, the bear charge for breaking up fog, the eagle's dive for slicing through gales. But the rituals diverged in crucial ways. Sami shamans often drummed in circular tents, their sound contained and amplified by the enclosed space. Viking seers worked in the open, their drums competing with the very storms they sought to master, a testament to their confrontational approach to nature. One Icelandic saga describes a völva standing knee-deep in frothing surf, drumming furiously as waves swallowed her legs, her rhythm never faltering until the storm abruptly veered eastward, sparing a fishing fleet. The account chillingly notes that when she finally stopped, her drumhead was dry despite the downpour, as if the storm had refused to touch her instrument. Modern meteorologists studying these traditions have uncovered startling parallels. The low-frequency vibrations produced by large drums can theoretically disrupt small-scale air pressure systems, not enough to stop a hurricane, but potentially sufficient to nudge a squall's path or hasten a cloudburst. Indigenous Sami communities still practice storm drumming today, with elders reporting measurable shifts in wind direction during ceremonies. Science can't yet fully explain it, just as it can't explain why certain Viking drumming sequences eerily mimic the infrasound patterns produced by earthquakes and tidal waves, frequencies too low for human ears, but which animals flee from instinctively. What's haunting is how these drums symbolize the Viking relationship with the uncontrollable. They didn't cower before nature's wrath, they answered it with rhythm, with artistry, with stubborn defiance. And in those hypnotic beats, we hear something timeless, the human refusal to surrender to the storm, even when the sky itself seems set against us. The blade wasn't just carving symbols, it was opening veins of power. Among the most feared and revered rituals of Viking Seers was the blood runes practice, where sacred glyphs weren't merely etched onto wood or stone, but directly into living flesh, using the carver's own blood as ink. Picture a völva bracing against the winter chill, her ritual knife glinting as she sliced into her forearm, each controlled wound forming the angular lines of answers for divine wisdom or thurisas for brute protection. As the blood welled up, she'd press a scrap of linen or birch bark against the cuts, capturing the crimson seepage before smearing it over rune-carved stakes or amulets, binding the spell's power to her very life force. This wasn't aimless self-harm. Every incision followed an exacting tradition. The runes had to bleed outward, never inward, a slash from left to right for blessings, right to left for curses. The depth mattered too. Shallow cuts for spells meant to linger like chronic pain, deep gouges for immediate, explosive results. Icelandic sagas recount a völva who carved alges, the protection rune, so deeply into her palm that the scar remained visible for decades, her descendants claiming storms diverted around her homestead as if the gods themselves still honored that long-dried blood oath. But the practice carried a heavy stigma. Viking society prized physical integrity, battle scars were honorable, but deliberate self-wounding for magic flirted with the taboo of ergi, a term implying unmanliness or perversion. Even Odin's self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil, where he hung for 9 nights to gain runic wisdom, was viewed with ambivalence, revered yet unsettling. Law codes from Gotland explicitly forbade blood rune rituals, punishing practitioners with exile, while other regions turned a blind eye so long as the spells benefited the community. This tension reveals the Norse moral tightrope. Magic was acceptable when harnessed for collective survival, but became dangerous when it blurred into self-destruction. The blood itself was believed to carry unique properties depending on its source. Menstrual blood, considered especially potent by seeresses, could amplify fertility or healing runes. The blood of a first kill, drawn from a warrior's initiation combat, was thought to vibrate with battle luck, but the most feared was silent blood, drawn without the victim's knowledge, like a sleeping enemy's or a child's scraped knee. The Flateyjarbók recounts a blacksmith's wife who stole her husband's blood as he snored, using it to carve runes that bound him to her will, until the spell backfired, turning his love into rabid obsession that ended in mutual destruction. Archaeological finds hint at the ritual's darker corners. At a dig near Trondheim, researchers uncovered a bone fragment etched with runes in iron-rich residue, likely dried blood, that translated to "I loosen the flesh to tighten fate." More chilling was the discovery of a völva's grave in Birka. her skeletal arms crisscrossed with fine cut marks precisely spaced to form repetitive runic patterns, suggesting a lifetime of ritual scarification. Forensic analysis revealed some wounds showed signs of deliberate reopening, as if she'd refreshed the spells periodically like a carver maintaining weathered inscriptions. What makes the Blood Runes ritual so compelling is its raw intimacy. Unlike distant incantations or symbolic offerings, this magic demanded the seer's literal flesh as collateral. Every throbbing cut was a reminder. Power wasn't given freely by the gods, it was bought in drops of scarlet currency, each bead of blood a down payment on forces no mortal could fully control. And in those glistening, self-inflicted glyphs, we see the Vikings' most visceral truth. Sometimes to rewrite destiny, you must first bleed the words yourself. Death wasn't the end of a seer's power, it was the final act of transmission. In the ritual known as the Last Sight, a dying Volva would gather her strength for one last grotesque gift, spitting into the mouth of a chosen successor, transferring a lifetime of visions in that foul, sacred exchange. Imagine the scene: flickering torchlight, the metallic tang of blood in the air, the rasping breath of the elder seer as she clutched the face of her apprentice, their lips nearly touching. This wasn't mere tradition, it was a visceral passing of the torch where saliva became the medium for everything the dying woman had ever foreseen. The saga of Thorbjörg the Volva paints the ritual in chilling detail. On her deathbed, weakened by age but sharp-eyed as ever, she demanded her youngest disciple lean close. "The sight is heavy," she warned, her voice like wind through dry grass, "and it will burn like mead in your throat." As the girl hesitated, Thorbjörg's hand snapped up, fingers digging into her jaw with surprising strength. The spit that passed between them wasn't just fluid, it was flecked with blood and something darker, described in the text as black grains like crushed night. The apprentice reportedly convulsed, her pupils dilating until her eyes looked like twin eclipses before collapsing for 3 days. When she awoke, she spoke in Thorbjörg's voice, reciting prophecies the dead woman had never shared aloud. But why spit? The Norse believed saliva carried traces of the soul's essence, a belief echoed in their legal customs where sealing a deal often involved spitting into a communal bowl. For seers whose power resided in their breath, chanting, whispering, sighing, the act took on monstrous intimacy. This wasn't just moisture, it was condensed knowledge, a physical transfer of the seer's connection to the unseen. Some accounts describe the spit as unnaturally thick, clinging to the recipient's teeth like tree sap, or glowing faintly in the dim light as if lit from within. The risks were as profound as the rewards. A successor unprepared for the influx of visions might go mad, her mind buckling under the weight of decades of foresight. One Icelandic chronicle tells of a girl who, after receiving the last sight, began screaming names no one recognized until a plague swept the region months later, killing in the exact order she'd listed. Others found their own memories overwritten, their childhoods replaced with the dead seer's past. The ritual demanded absolute trust. There was no taking back what had been given. Archaeology offers eerie support. In a völva's grave near Firkat, Denmark, researchers found a small bronze vial hanging from a necklace, its interior coated with a residue that matched descriptions of the black grains from Thorbjörg's saga. Chemical analysis revealed traces of henbane and human DNA. Was this a vessel for storing the ritual spit, preserving it until the right successor appeared? Or had some seers, fearing their knowledge might die with them, left their essence bottled like mead for future generations? What chills most is how the last sight reflects the Viking view of destiny, not as a solitary burden, but as a chain stretching across generations. The spit wasn't just a transfer, it was a tether, binding the living to the dead in a lineage of grim wisdom. And in that final, gagging gasp of fluid, the seers proved their greatest truth. Some gifts aren't given gently, they're forced upon you like a fistful of prophecy shoved down your throat. The echoes of Viking Seers didn't fade with the longships. They slithered into the marrow of European witchcraft, transforming but never disappearing. Take the völva's staff, a symbol of her authority, found in graves like the one at Firkat, Denmark, carved with intricate knotwork and topped with a bronze finial resembling a serpent's head. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you'll find nearly identical staffs clutched by accused witches in woodcuts and trial records, their purpose twisted into something sinister by Christian fear. What Norse seeresses wielded as bridges to the divine, medieval Europe branded as demonic conduits, the difference a matter of centuries and dogma. Archaeology threads these connections tighter. In Norway, a wand fragment was unearthed from a 10th century völva's grave, its surface grooved with runes invoking Freyja. 500 years later, similar wands appear in the confessions of Scottish cunning folk, their tips blackened not by ritual fire but by witch hunters' torches. The design was nearly identical, a tapering length of hardwood, often yew or oak, with spiral carvings to steer magic. Even the grip patterns matched, suggesting an unbroken lineage of craft passed in whispers. The henbane charm, a Viking-era pouch filled with hallucinogenic seeds, found tucked beneath a seer's jawbone, mirrors the witch bottles of Elizabethan England, where herbs and nails were buried under thresholds to repel evil. The ingredients evolved, but the intent stayed frozen in time. Control the unseen, whatever the cost. Folklore absorbed these rituals like soil soaking blood. The Norse seer's habit of riding fences, literally straddling property boundaries to chant protections, morphed into the witch's broomstick, a symbol of liminality turned into a parody. The völva's feather cloak, meant to mimic Hugin and Munen's flight, became the tattered shawl of the night hag in Germanic tales. Even the blood eagle augury's brutality found new life in witch trials, where prosecutors claimed coven initiates were marked by carving invisible runes into their flesh. The Vikings saw magic in the visceral. Europe later feared it there, but the most damning evidence lies in language itself. The Old Norse word Seiðr Ceremony fractured into regional dialects, Seiðr in Iceland, Seidr in Orkney, until it emerged in Scots Gaelic as Sudan, a term for witches who sang winds. The völva's chants to steer storms became the witch's curse to summon them. When Shakespeare wrote of the weird sisters in Macbeth, their cauldron and prophecies weren't pure invention. They were distant cousins of the seer's Mead visions, their tangled words a garbled echo of runic spells. Perhaps the starkest testament to this legacy is a discovery in a Bavarian monastery library, a medieval grimoire with a lone Viking age page sewn into its spine. On it, a völva's ritual to unwind, a curse, transcribed in Latin but peppered with untranslated Norse phrases, as if the scribe feared altering the original incantation's power. The page was charred at the edges, yet the runes remained legible, their lines cutting sharp as the day they were inked. 1,000 years of persecution couldn't erase the seer's fingerprints. They're still here, in the warp of history's weave, whispering through the cracks. The rhythmic hum of a drum fills a dimly lit room in Portland, Oregon, where 21st century hands trace patterns in the air, not with iron blades but with smartphone light displays synced to synthesized chants. This is neo-pagan Seidr, a modern reimagining of Viking trance rituals where apps replace bone runes and Zoom circles stretch across continents. The revival of ancient Norse practices today isn't about slavish historical reenactment, it's a living dialogue between parchment and pixel, where tradition collides with contemporary spiritual hunger. Workshops from Reykjavik to Minnesota teach adapted Seidr, stripping away blood sacrifices but keeping the core, altered states, communal energy, and the relentless pursuit of unseen truths. Critics scoff at the sanitized versions, where Viking seers drank hallucinogenic brews, modern practitioners sip herbal tea. Where völvas carved curses into flesh, neo-pagans journal intentions into glossy planners. Yet the heart of the ritual remains startlingly intact. At a Berlin retreat, participants report the same eerie sensations described in Saga's tingling skin, involuntary trembling, voices that aren't theirs slipping through their lips. The tools have changed, the trembling or hasn't. Rune divination exemplifies this tension between old and new. Traditionalists insist on hand-carved oak or bone tiles, charged under moonlight with whispered invocations. But Etsy shops now sell mass-produced rune sets laser-etched with hashtags like #VikingVibes, while TikTok seers conduct readings via livestream, their algorithms suggesting protective rune combos based on user data. Purists rage at the commodification, but others argue accessibility matters more than purity. A disabled practitioner in Glasgow notes that arthritis prevents her from carving runes, but a 3D printed set lets her continue a lineage that might have excluded her 1,000 years ago. The debate over authenticity often overlooks a key truth. Even the original seers adapted. Archaeological evidence shows völvas incorporated Sami drumming techniques, Celtic knotwork, and Christian symbols as those influences seeped into Viking land. Modern reconstructions are just the latest layer in that evolution. A Seattle coven mixes Seidr with mindfulness meditation, framing it as neurodivergent shadow work. A Norwegian group uses biofeedback devices to map trance states, merging mysticism with science. Neither approach would be recognizable to a 10th century völva, but neither would electric lights or antibiotics. What's undeniable is the longing driving this revival. In an age of climate crises and digital isolation, the old rituals offer something primal. A sense of agency, a connection to natural rhythms, a way to scream into the void and sometimes, just sometimes, hear an echo. Whether that echo comes from God's psychology or collective imagination hardly matters. The seers would have understood that. After all, they too lived on the edge of chaos, spinning meaning from the dark. From the visceral horror of the blood eagle augury to the haunting beauty of the frost moon chant, these 30 rituals paint a staggering portrait of Viking seers, not as caricatures wielding crude magic, but as sophisticated architects of the unseen. Their practices spanned brutality and tenderness, from rolling cursed stones downhill to whispering lullabies to restless ancestor spirits. They didn't just predict the future, they wrestled with it, negotiating with gods, corpses, and even the wind itself. What unites these rituals isn't their methods. Some were blood-soaked, others almost meditative, but their unshakable belief that the world was alive with voices waiting to be heard. These seers existed in the liminal space between realms we now call religion, magic, and psychology. When a völva brewed the mead of prophecy, was she invoking Freyja's divine power or unlocking her own subconscious through hallucinogens? When she deciphered the screams of a dying man, was she channeling Odin's wisdom or interpreting the raw human terror of a soul straddling life and death? The Vikings didn't draw these distinctions. To them, the spiritual was practical, the mystical was tactical, and every ritual, no matter how grotesque or poetic, was a tool for survival in a world that offered no guarantees. Their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern therapy's emphasis on trance states echoes the Seiðr Ceremony's rhythmic drumming. The placebo effect mirrors the oath ring's power belief made tangible through ritual. Even our obsession with manifesting destiny isn't so far removed from the Norn binding ritual, where carved bones held the weight of rewritten fate. The seers understood something we're still grasping. That meaning isn't found, it's forged in blood, in chants, in the quiet moments before dawn when the world feels thin enough to tear. So tell us, which ritual gripped you? Was it the primal terror of the wild hunt, or the delicate intimacy of the dream pillow, the bone-chilling whispers of the skulls, or the defiant drumbeats against the storm? Drop your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe. History's deepest mysteries are waiting, and trust us, the seers aren't done speaking yet.